Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Open Score, our new annual conference that will explore how technology continues to transform art and culture and how the digital age is fueling massive revolutionary changes that are profoundly changing the way that we think and live. Sometimes it's really overwhelming, the pace of these changes and the volume of them. It's hard to believe that the iPhone only made its appearance 8.5 years ago, and most of us no longer remember what the world was like before then. The infiltration of the digital into every facet of our lives, whether through smartphones, which give us the ability to communicate with anyone at any time, in any place, or by virtue of surveillance and information sifting algorithms that have erased traditional boundaries of public and private, have ushered in a new age that defines our century. Armies of engineers are hard at work on artificial intelligence and virtual reality. Intelligent robots will be here very soon, and we seem to quickly be overtaking science fiction. What does this mean for art and artists? How are these sweeping and accelerating changes affecting our sector? The new museum was founded to support new forms of art making and art in an expanded field. It's natural for us to explore emerging media and emerging ideas around them. We've long been at the forefront of digital art and culture, and we're often the first to identify and present key artists and voices in this burgeoning interdisciplinary field. While primarily centered on artists, the museum's approach is notable for its inclusion of engineers, entrepreneurs, critics, designers, architects, and critics who are shaping the future of culture. Rhizome, the leading digital arts organization, became an affiliate organization in residence here at the New Museum over a decade ago. Their 7-on-7 conference has been at the forefront of pairing artists and technologists to create new works. Last year, we opened New Inc., the first museum-led incubator to support 100 creatives working at the intersection of art, technology, and design. Last week at this time, to a sold-out audience, 10 teams presented their projects. We also recently released the anthology Mass Effect, Art and the Internet in the 21st Century, co-published with MIT Press and co-edited by Lauren Cornell and Ed Halter. Also want to mention that Lauren Cornell's exhibitions at the New Museum, from Free to the recent triennial Surround audience, have been pioneering efforts to define some of these sweeping changes and have really served as an acknowledged inspiration for such upcoming shows as suspended animation at the Hirshhorn and electronic superhighway at the Whitechapel, soon to open. So this new annual conference, Open Score, is co-presented by the New Museum and Rhizome. I want to thank Lauren Cornell, who is our curator and associate director of technology initiatives at the New Museum, and former director of Rhizome, and Zach Kaplan, our current executive director of Rhizome, and Michael Connor, artistic director at Rhizome, for organizing this terrific program and for allowing us to entertain the paradoxes. Special thanks to the Rauschenberg Foundation for supporting this inaugural conference in honor of the 50th anniversary of Experiments in Art and Technology. And thank you all for coming.
Hi everyone, can you hear me? I'm Lauren Cornell. Thank you so much for those remarks, Lisa. So I'm going to be really brief because we have a lot is going to happen in a very short time today. But I just wanted to say that, Lisa mentioned Mass Effect, and I organized this conference with Rhizome on the heels of finishing that book. I co-edited it with Ed Halter, who's moderating the second panel today. And Mass Effect charted kind of what we saw as some of the most significant trends or changes in art engaging the internet over the past 15 years. And so I went into this conference thinking about some of those key changes. So things that are going to be discussed today: artists engaging social media and considering identity and how identity is branded on social media, artists dealing with surveillance and how that's inflected by digital technologies. These all have significant histories by this point. At the same time, we put Mass Effect to bed sometime in the middle of 2015. And so much has happened since that time. So I know that the panelists today are really going to address urgencies and really what's happening around those subjects to date. I also want to mention Rhizome again. It's wonderful to partner with them on this event. This is one of two programs that we co-organize with Rhizome. The other one is a commissioning program. And I just want to acknowledge the new director, Zach Kaplan. I'm really excited at the energy that he's brought into the organization. I'm going to make a few logistical remarks, but first, Michael Connor is going to speak.
Touch someone who is not touching you. Touch two places on your body where you are ticklish. Don't laugh. Except not laugh. Draw a rectangle in the air as high as you can reach. All right, now we're getting somewhere. Today's conference is held on the 50th anniversary year of the series 9 Evenings, Theater and Technology, staged in 1966 at the old 69th Regiment Armory. Each of the performances during the 9 Evenings involved the work of an artist working in collaboration with engineers from Bell Labs. The instructions I just read are part of the score from the piece by Robert Rauschenberg in collaboration with those engineers, which was titled Open Score. It's from the second act. Some of you may know that work. There's a great DVD of it that's out. But probably the most enduring image from it would be from the first act when Frank Stella and tennis pro Mimi Kennerek play tennis in the vast space of the armory. Each time they struck the ball, a contact microphone on their racket would pick up the sound and broadcast it to all of the speakers. And meanwhile, each time they struck the ball, another light in the armory would go off until they were playing in complete darkness. I understand that during one of the performances, the technology behind this didn't work and the lights switching off had to happen manually, which often is the case with art and technology collaborations. So this series 9 Evenings, which was organized by Rauschenberg and engineer Billy Kluver, led to the establishment of experiments in art and technology the following year, which is a relatively short-lived but enormously influential group that aimed to facilitate collaborations between artists and technologists. I was fortunate to see Kluver speak in 2002, or maybe 3. And at that point in time, I was fairly young and I didn't entirely know what I was seeing, but I did have the impression that he felt that his work with experiments in art and technology had been something of a failure, or it didn't quite achieve what he had hoped that it might, and achieve a kind of sustained collaboration over time between artists and technologists. Since that time, I've come to think that often the most important projects in this world are the ones that are left unfinished for others to take up. And I think that experiments in art and technology was such a project. It was gloriously not a failure, but just unfinished. And so it's a tremendous privilege to be standing here in this conference, which is titled after one of the projects that was originally under the auspices of 9 Evenings, to continue one strand of that conversation, which I think we all can agree is bigger than any single project could ever hope to resolve. So not a failure, but incomplete. And I want to say a special sort of recognition to Julie Martin, who's done so much to champion the legacy and history of experiments in art and technology. She's sitting here. Hi, Julie. So we have a lot to live up to today.
Thank you all for coming. I'm really excited about this panel. I'm really honored to be moderating it, and I feel like my role as moderator is to talk as little as possible and let these 4 amazing artists and writers talk the most. So we are going to do, everyone is going to do a brief sort of introduction to their work and their kind of general concerns around the topic of this particular panel, which you can read little bit about in the book. But generally, we're kind of talking about social media and the promise of the internet after Web 2.0. I'm just going to quickly introduce about a sentence for each of the panelists, and then they're going to speak in the order of Simon Denny, and then Jacob Chiocci, Kathy Park Hong, and then Juliana Huxtable will give a short introduction to their work, and we'll talk after that. So Simon Denny is an artist. He most recently had a work at the New Zealand Pavilion at the Venice Biennale. He has a show up at the Serpentine currently called Products for Organizing. It's open till February 14th, so if you're in London, stop by that. And he most recently in New York had an exhibition at PS1 called Innovator's Dilemma. Kathy Park Hong is a poet and critic. Her most recent book is Engine Empire. She's an associate professor of poetry at Sarah Lawrence, and she is the poetry editor of The New Republic. And Jacob Chiocci is an artist, and he is a founding member of Extreme Animals and Paper Rad. And Juliana Huxtable is a writer, a performer. She recently had a performance at the MoMA with Performa called There Are Certain Facts That Remain That Are Not in Dispute. So we'll start with Jacob.
Okay, is that all right, everybody? So these are two stills from a video that I finished in 2014. The video is called The Urgency. It's 30 minutes long, mostly made of found footage found from the internet and social media. And it was made in collaboration with Extreme Animals, which is myself and David Whiteman. You can see on the right here is a quote that this is at the very beginning of the video. So it's the first thing you see. It's also on all of the packaging. This video was released as a DVD as well as an online release and a VHS tape. This is dedicated to all the people who have had their lives wrecked by computers, the internet, or social media. Okay, so that's the first quote I want to read. The second quote is by Kendall Jenner from the Kardashians. I think social media has taken over for our generation. I hate it sometimes. Like, I literally want to throw my phone so I can't look at it. It's all a made-up world if you think about it. Social media, everything. This interview, everything. It's not real. It's pretty crazy. Okay. And then the last quote I want to read is from, I believe, like maybe the first sermon by the Buddha. And it goes, and you can replace the wet rope that he's talking about with the word social media. So, it easily happens that a man, when taking a bath, steps upon a wet rope and imagines that it is a snake. Horror will overcome him, and he will shake from fear, anticipating in his thought all the agonies caused by the serpent's venomous bite. What a relief does this man experience when he sees that the rope is no snake. The cause of his fright lies in his error, his ignorance, his illusion. If the true nature of the rope is recognized, his tranquility of mind will come back to him. He will feel relieved. He will be joyful and happy. This is the state of mind of one who has recognized that there is no self, that the cause of all his troubles, cares, and vanities is a mirage, a shadow, a dream. So I think that what I've kind of been trying to research with my art and my thinking is this sort of thing that I guess I would describe as a combination of self-love and self-hate that happens when we use social media and before social media. I think it's something that has been going on in societies from the beginning of time. I think that now this is just kind of a newer version of that, and maybe not even that different of a version that we're trying to grapple with right now. And I also tend to kind of expand the definition of technology to sort of, I think of technology as anything that organizes or takes apart reality. So for me, technology isn't just a cell phone or a smartphone, but it's thoughts that happen in your mind or ways of behaving, normative ways of behaving. So Yeah, that's the kind of stuff I've been thinking about that is in this video, is also hopefully in some of these quotes that I just read. That's it for me.
Cool. Thank you, Jacob. Simon?
Yeah. Oh, here's my slide. Wonderful. So I'm just going to describe how helpful and rich I've found LinkedIn and Behance as social media things. This is a slide summary of the centerpiece of my artwork that I made for the New Zealand Pavilion at Venice this year. It's a redrawn self-portrait of David D'Archicourt, who is an amazing artist that I came across through these platforms while looking for a way to understand the artistic context of the images that were released as part of the Snowden archive. To the right are the excerpts from his LinkedIn profile that describe his role, self-described role, at the NSA as creative director. And then also to the left is a VPN tracking program from the leaked slides called Poison Nut, which I found in a 2014 release that Der Spiegel did. When the slides were released, I was really disappointed at the public response to the kind of supposedly, as quoted often, like bad design of the slides. Because I thought actually that they were kind of sublime. And I had a kind of very positive and rich experience when I looked through those images, particularly the ones that I couldn't find anywhere else on the internet, you know, because there's kind of original images in those slides as well as kind of found images. So I was really interested in looking for the authors, like looking for the artistic context of the people that were making what I found to be very exciting and relevant imagery. And I made an exhibition then around this guy that I discovered through this, around D'Archicourt, which posed him as a kind of contemporary master of depicting the value of knowledge. And I also tried to underline this reading of his work by presenting versions of it, of other work from the Snowden archive in a kind of beautiful Renaissance library that is itself a kind of allegory, or was built as an allegory for the value of knowledge. Then it holds like masterpieces of paintings and cartography from the center of the Venetian Empire when it was. So Titian and Fra Mauro were kind of intelligence imaging masters of that time, and I was saying that D'Archicourt, this man here, was a master of the contemporary world of image making. To underline some of the urgent feelings of the content of the Snowden archive, I kind of kept this man in the dark as well of his centrality that he played in my exhibition. So even when I included a new commission of his work, I didn't tell him that he was the star of the show. Then The Guardian stepped in, and the Guardian writer Charlotte Higgins came and broke the story to him, phoning him up and asking him about his work and his role in the NSA the day before the exhibition opened. His response was very, very beautiful to me, and he kind of was very happy to be featured and flattered to be involved as long as his work was attributed, and indeed it was heavily attributed. And he opened up more of an understanding about what artists do in such powerful organizations and why kind of quirky illustration is a valuable tool. He kind of basically said that complex and boring things that happen, like large technological programs for surveillance and also large management technologies, become tangible through the work of authors and illustrators like him. He also admitted in the fact to authoring this Poison Nut logo. So this, to my knowledge, was the first time that we had a real attribution of some of the material, and an author saying, yes, I made those images in the slides, which was great for me because as a New Zealander, we're involved in that surveillance program, and our Prime Minister at that stage was still saying that they were complete fiction. So it was an example of how, to me, aesthetic research through great resources like this can lead to important things like attribution. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Simon. Kathy?
Hi. I think, actually, rather than talk about my own work, I'm going to talk about poetry in general and its relationship to the internet now. It's actually difficult to determine how the internet has changed poetry. If we're talking about the first person, I will say that poetry has always been invested in the first person. Poets have been oversharing way before the internet. But I think what has changed, of course, is that there are now new forums in which to overshare. Poets can now overshare on Tumblr and not wait for years to get published through the ridiculous pyramid scheme that are called book contests. And now, because of sites like Tumblr, poets don't have to publish books. Without publishing a single book, poets can accrue huge followers through their Tumblr poetry. The closest analogy of this would be, oh, that's better. The closest analogy of this to art would be how artists use Instagram to distribute their work. I have a friend, for instance, who actually acquired a gallerist from posting his paintings online. This follows a classic model of technology democratizing a creative field. But now what we must also acknowledge, however, is how technology, user-generated platforms like Tumblr, also molds the shape and language of poetry. If someone were to have asked me years ago how the internet would affect and change poetic language, I would have said that language would have gotten weirder, that it would have gotten more polyphonic, closer hewing to music nowadays like MIA, borrowing indiscriminately, mashing up language from different sources. Basically, poetic language would have gotten more difficult. But actually, the kind of poetry that's popular online has become more flattened, more transparent. The confessional content has become more emojified. Following Silicon Valley's ethos, poetic language has become more efficient. In Lynn Heginian's classic essay, Rejection of Closure, she discusses the difference between open text and closed text. Closed text is poetry that works in a coercive epiphanic mode, whereas open text, because it is difficult, invites participation. You make your own meaning. It rejects the authority of the writer over the reader. So closed text would be something that is more user-friendly. Now, a classic example of open text would actually be Gertrude Stein's Tender Buttons. But if Gertrude Stein's Tender Buttons was published today on the internet, Stein would actually have very few Tumblr followers. Now, at this point, I'm sounding very cynical about poetry that's published online, but I'm also kind of hopeful. Poetry has become more interactive, but not in the reading process of the poem, but more interactive in community building. What I'm observing now, which I wouldn't say was happening even 2 years ago, is a shift away from the first person to the first person plural. Since Ferguson, racial conflict has been in the media headlines and it's spilled over into the poetry community. What's been galvanizing has been the surge of activism in poetry, which has been facilitated and even made possible by social media. Poets are protesting the racist practices of law enforcement like other Americans, but this has also spilled into questioning racist institutional practices in literature, and much of it is happening online. Flame wars, endless threads debating institutional racism, calling established writers out, sharing viral think pieces that are screeds against Vanessa Place or an editor's racist reply to a tweet, or creating hashtags like hashtag actual Asian poet, kind of unfortunate hashtag, but anyway. This has overtaken the selfie. In poetry, Twitter as a marketing tool has become instead a tool for social commentary. I would also argue that poetry, more than any other discipline, more than visual arts or fiction, is probably more invested in the present racial crisis because it is small, because poetry has no stake in the market, and is therefore open to alternative economies of engagement. Poetry, in other words, has nothing to lose. Whether this may rehabilitate institutions remains to be seen. A cynic may say that social commentary on race is just another form of social capital that poets use for visibility, that corporate industries use for clickbait. Others consider the racial unrest in poetry as a toxic distraction from the actual poem itself. What's actually happening online, though, is what's part of poetry. The Facebook thread is another form of the manifesto. And what we're seeing, at least with the help of social media, is that a demographic which has been ignored is refusing to be ignored and is speaking up and calling out.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Kathy. Juliana?
I think that this panel is kind of interesting because the premise of the panel, in a lot of ways, at least in terms of like, you know, branding or trying to sort of like express your work without being trapped by the necessity of sort of promoting yourself in social media and things like that, or maybe a feeling of like violation in terms of what the internet represents in relationship to your work, but I think it's kind of difficult me to talk about it because I feel like I'm still in that crisis right now in a lot of ways. I was a technology and internet baby. My mom worked in IT, and so growing up, I was like, I had like, a computer when I was like 3 years old. I already knew how to like fully engage the internet and what it represented. And I think for a long time, it represented on one hand a sort of escapism in a lot of ways. And before it was necessarily as widely distributed as it was, it operated on a certain set of implicit antagonisms, whether it was young people, so identifying with the internet and MySpace as something that was an expression of youth in opposition to my mother, who sort of sees it as an IT person. She goes to Oracle Open World conferences, but fundamentally has no understanding of what social media means. And so I sort of, as I grew up, you transition from MySpace, then you have LiveJournal, you have Zynga, and you sort of just advance with these things. And it feels, you trust it implicitly because it's just a sort of like part of the trappings of how you exist and sort of advance in the world. And I think that the first time that really started to change for me was when my work, which largely existed initially on spaces like Tumblr, like I have always had a sort of necessary relationship with social media, especially as a way of building communities that I cannot find or access in my immediate life. And so, LiveJournal was that for me when I was in school and was sort of like picked on and felt isolated from the other kids around me, yada, yada, yada. But I think what's interesting right now is that there's a sort of like crisis because I feel like and being so self-aware and having such a sort of gaze on me and my work through social media, have become aware of a lot of the sort of violations that have been happening all along the way that I haven't been aware of. And so on a very basic sort of, like an anecdotal example would be realizing that if you click one step backwards on your Facebook profile, all of the embarrassing pictures from when you were in high school and totally were unaware of how to like posture yourself are sitting there. And sort of this feeling of like, oh my God, I didn't even realize that as it's become more and more democratized in some ways, but also just like popular, you lose a lot and you feel exposed. I feel a lot of times I felt a sense of loss. Like I went back recently, and this was sort of the starting point for the performance that I just finished, was really feeling like there was wanting to go back and find like all of the online communities that I sought out when I was in high school that were centered around sort of like alternate sort of scholarship around Black history. So not being able to access that in my school, and sort of the most beautiful, I think, idea or example of the democracy of the internet literally being like alternate schools, libraries, sources of knowledge, classes. And at a certain point, I realized that none of that was there and there was no archive of that. And so a loss of that and trying to recuperate that, and where does that knowledge go, and the sort of illusion that I was given that, we have text and the internet is this sort of democratic space, also then becomes a question of archiving and the ephemerality of that space. And so it's really difficult for me right now because I'm dealing with, these questions of like loss, mourning, exposure, a loss of privacy, while operating at the time that social media is the most necessary. It's so necessary and it's so omnipresent that it becomes really difficult to express or deal with those questions through social media itself. And so I guess the way that I've been dealing with that crisis up to this point is to make work that doesn't necessarily engage or Instagram or like social media so literally, because my relationship to it is kind of like really kind of caustic and sort of like unresolved right now. And so that's where I've been making work from, and performance has felt really good because it's a lot of immediacy. Like writing has felt like a way of dealing with it because I don't really know how I feel about the parameters of social media itself enough to really use that as a form. So I guess that's a sort of crisis that I'm dealing with, and I guess in some ways that relates to the premise of the panel.
Thank you. So just based on sort of these opening statements, one thing that I'm kind of thinking about with all of you in your work is this: we seem to have this dilemma of the self we bring to social media and then the self that kind of comes out in many ways. And we kind of circling around this idea of how the language and design of the web shapes us. And I've been thinking a lot about this Jessie Darling quote from an essay that's in Mass Effect. I'm just going to read that, and maybe you all can respond to this, but I think it relates to everything we're talking about. And she has this notion of junk space, which you can find elsewhere, but she says that they say that social media is to the read-write web what sprawl is to the metropolis of modernity. A homogeneous, cancerous, rhizomatic junk space that extends exponentially outward on a sludgy wave of strip malls and sponsored links, greed, and induced demand. And they later conclude, it took about 350 years, but finally in virtuality, cogito ergo sum has come to mean something very concrete and actual. Now is a place, a coordinate, I am where I am not, and I think, type, write, and right-click, therefore I am. So I was wondering if we could maybe talk about that a little more. And I mean, I think this was something that you were kind of thinking about in many ways, Simon, with sort of this notion of design and how design sort of shapes the web. And that's the kind of one element we have very little control over.
Yeah, I mean, my response to that would be, I like urban sprawl.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm a fan of the way that has all played out, and I like the messiness of it, and I think it's beautiful. So yeah, maybe that would be my response, but I'm sure there's other people here who have things to say on that, potentially.
I mean, what I was going to say is actually, I think, kind of based off of one thing you said, which is like the feeling of loss that happens when all of a sudden a website that you had a huge emotional connection to is gone. And so to call it junk is sort of like, it is, the thing I think is so interesting maybe about the internet is that it's simultaneously junk and also very important. And I think it's important to, as you said, like begin to figure out how to archive these spaces that were simultaneously meaningless and meaningful. You know, I think that one of the things I love the most about the internet is that like play between the banal and the rich, or whatever the other word is, you know, like somebody that's, you know, posting something that they may or may not think is important at the time, but they may think is important 10 years later, you know.
I think that's an interesting part. I would like to say that the difference, though, between what's happening online and sort of the city as an urban sprawl is that when you think about the city, a building gets torn down and a new building gets built up. You know, things disappear. Things don't disappear on the internet. You know, and so it's interesting that you're talking about sort of the lost archive. I mean, there's definitely this mourning or this loss, but at the same time, we're also in this crisis where there's this hypertrophy of memory, where actually everything is archived. We're just what trails us is like our whole life on social media. And it's us, I mean, I can't talk about it from an artistic point of view, but from like a literary point of view, I mean, one sort of function of writing is being witness, being a witness, right? Or recording memory, or, using writing as a means to remember something. And it's like, what does that make? What is literature then if nothing is forgotten, And in certain ways we, especially now, I think there's also this kind of desire to forget as much as there is a desire to remember.
I guess in response to that, I would say that I also think it's important to think of what's happening, because one of the things that I think oftentimes happens with discussion surrounding the net and technology is you get this sort of like, everything becomes this like mass of just like, the internet or the junk of the internet. And we think of it as this just like not atemporal, just like mass of information, data, images, et cetera. But I think it's important to also like historicize what that means, because in terms of the idea that everything is archived, at least in terms of what that means as the general public being able to access that, I think that started at a certain point, and I think that largely revolves around things that we take for granted. So like Google and Google Archive as something specifically that only exists at a certain point. Like it's sort of thought of as universal, that Google Archive sort of represents this some sort of text that you can access that you can never erase it, but that only started at a certain point. I remember when it was, mama.com was like a search engine, or these like, bingo, boingo, like these sort of like things that are now kind of like jokes that you think of as like spam, but I think it's important to historicize what that means, because I think like what I really, and one of the things that was really important to me was the way that knowledge, specific like knowledge was circulated on the internet, and specifically like, sort of like what you might think of as like reference library sort of information. So like history, anthropology, and the way that that type of information has sort of been circulated, mutated, changed, I think is really indicative of a lot of the concerns that we're talking about, because a lot of those sites literally did disappear, and maybe there's some archive somewhere, or some document, or someone has a screenshot, but in terms of what it means, in terms of accessibility, it's kind of vanished. And I think one of the examples of that was when sort of GeoCities was shut down. And there are projects that have like archived it, but the way that it's indexed and sort of accessible is just as important as like the sort of material itself. But I think if you think of it historically, some of those questions become less, this mass that we're all sort of tied to.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious about this idea of the internet as a memory and as an archive, and sort of the efforts we make to resist that and to challenge that. I mean, we have Google that does sort of create this almost diaristic, massive text, and we also have these efforts like in Europe to challenge Google's authority to hold on to certain memories for us. And I'm kind of curious about your guys' feelings and thoughts, sort of regarding the kind of the dangers and the pitfalls of the internet as a kind of archive and as a kind of repository, and sort of how, if at all, is art sort of like prepared or unique in its ability to kind of challenge those notions. I mean, a lot of us, Jacob, one thing we kind of had a back and forth before about sort of this idea of wreckage and whether or not these predefined spaces sort of, that you can actually do anything with them in the end. And you had sort of mentioned that the real place to look right now online for stuff would be like the dark web and things like this stuff that kind of strives to escape the memory space of it.
Yeah. I mean, I think I was talking in reference to this idea of this project I did in the early 2000s, Paper Ad, which is a collaboration between 3 people, and it kind of existed in a period of the internet pre-social media for the most part. And I think it was really, in my experience, a much easier time to be anonymous and to exist within various cultural spaces without being kind of pinned down. So one of the things that I think felt really good about that project is that, at least for a 2 or 3 year period, we kind of simultaneously equally existed within subculture, art, music, comics, net art, and it was really hard and confusing for a mass audience in a productive way to understand what it was. And I feel that is very hard for me now to kind of redo something like that, and I wouldn't want to redo it, but I was, in an email to you, I was saying that the only place that I can think of that might actually still have that kind of like confusion for me would probably be looking into the dark web, which is I've never been to the dark web.
Kathy, did you have a response?
No, not really. I mean, I guess like, what I'm struggling to do is, for me, it's like, we could talk on and on about how the internet is a big wasteland, of image flow, just this maze of, or hall of JPEGs and so forth. But I guess what I'm struggling to do, and I think maybe some other writers are trying to do, is how to find how to recuperate community through the internet. Part of it, I believe, rather than acknowledging that it's soul destroying, yes, we all agree it's soul destroying, but I don't also agree with that. I think actually, I think there is actual communities that can be built from that. And also, one method I've been noticing that I've been interested in is kind of a backlash, or taking yourself away from the internet. I've noticed that with a lot more writers, at least myself included, that they've been more interested in sort of actual performances or like a return to the body, whatever that means. And I don't know. I mean, we are in it, so it's hard to kind of step back and actually see how it's going to be historicized, and how we're going to sort of find some sort of power before it overpowers us.
Yeah. I mean, I think we're all kind of interested in this like general idea of the backlash too. Like this kind of, I mean, it's not a new phenomenon, but it has a very distinct character on Facebook. Like, particularly in poetry, recently there have been some very terrible performances, and it's become a real venue for people to finally say enough is enough with this kind of thing. And so I've become really interested in that because it becomes a real meaningful space actually for people to say and to share links to other websites that articulate an actual position that really changes the conversation and changes the direction of something like poetry or something. And I was wondering actually, Juliana, if you have some thoughts on this, because this is something I know you talk a lot about in your own work, in particular in the MoMA performance. This was an issue.
Well, it's sort of funny because a lot of that performance in particular, at least in terms of like what I felt, the necessity of the text being something that was present and was like performed and was inaccessible, at least at the time, on paper or online, because I've increasingly had a feeling of like claustrophobia and like suffocation surrounding what the relationship between social media as a way to circulate work and form communities that are critical in nature, even if it's just a sort of de facto criticism by virtue of the fact that no one engages it versus engaging it. But for me, I sort of, sometimes it becomes this kind of absurd romantic notion that there was like a golden age, there's like a zone that you're in, and like it's, like when you're in it, it represents like, okay, this is where it's at, it's really productive, people kind of don't really know about me, so I'm like, I can sort of operate kind of like what you were saying in terms of simultaneity. Like I felt like I had all of these different things happening, and I existed in these different realms, and it sort of felt like a source of freedom, and Facebook was almost at that point kind of like a residual sort of concern, but increasingly, regardless of whether or not I choose to actively engage, distribute, circulate my work online, it exists beyond me, and sort of the idea of like a Wikipedia article where someone sort of butchers your personal history and posts these things that you're like, oh my God, I like hate the way that this is like represented, but there's almost this responsibility that you can't escape, and so for me, I think, similarly maybe to what you were saying, like creating these spaces that exist outside of that and that aren't necessarily documented, but nonetheless might be dealing with questions pertinent to it has been like productive for me to sort of sidestep that.
Right. We really only have time for one more question, but I actually want to return to you, Simon, because so much of your work is about sort of the sort of like corporate or public entities that sort of shape the internet and sort of design the internet for us and essentially establish the rules by which any kind of event on social media happens. But you despite sort of your investigation into the NSA and all of that and sort of exploring the ways that they shape information flow, we were talking earlier this morning over coffee, and you were saying how like positive you remain, which I think is really great. And we've been sort of circling around this idea of social media and its potential for community and also the drawbacks, but I was wondering if you could sort of speak generally about your positivity.
Definitely. No, I mean, I just find, I think these worlds change so quickly and people in power change so quickly, maybe. I just find branding stories, if we're going to talk about like powerful brands and the way that they imagine what's possible in the internet, to be very inspiring. And so, I don't know. I'm always I desperately read and follow tech blogs and tech communities and new companies because I find it kind of never-ending source of new excitement and new ways to understand the world, because business models are constantly being created which reframe the way that we can engage with these things. And so I just find it like a constantly renewing space, and it changes in different directions, and different things are possible. Maybe anonymity is less possible, for example. Cross-platform things become less possible, but because of like over-identification and like the fact that you can be so clearly defined then brings a new business model. I just think these spaces are just quick at accelerating the ways to understand how we can engage and how that platform can change. But
Yeah, and I do think that's true. I think that, like, you know, Silicon Valley probably already has picked up on this need for anonymity.
definitely, I mean, Snapchat being a weird example of that sort of didn't work, but kind of did, right?
Right.
Isn't it the biggest one now?
Yeah, but it's weird because it started off as this anonymity thing, and now it's kind of like a content creator. Like, it's kind of like MTV now, which is kind of a weird pivot. But that's interesting. You know, I tend to see businesses as a historicizing engine, you know, and something, because business is such a kind of clear responder to what's needed in a market. Then these entrepreneurs become, for me, like cultural leaders and artists. And the way that Snapchat changed from responding to anonymity to responding to needing to be a new type of platform, that to me said something about understanding what's important online.
Right.